Hello all, my name is Yossi and today's lesson is one of several in which I discuss Isaiah chapter 53. Today we will show that Isaiah 53 is actually an integral part of a large section of the book of Isaiah and that it cannot be read alone if you truly want to understand it. This lesson is dedicated to the memories of my parents, my father and teacher Avraham Shmuel ben Simcha Bonim, and my mother and teacher Chana bat Shimon. Whenever I discuss the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, with Christians, one of the first chapters that comes up is Isaiah 53. Jews insist that the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is the nation of Israel, while Christians insist that this chapter refers to Jesus. Today we will examine parallel word usage throughout Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 in order to show how deeply connected Isaiah 53 is with adjacent chapters of Isaiah, and therefore, just as those chapters mostly speak of Israel, so too Isaiah 53 speaks of Israel. One quick note before we get started. All of the translations that we use today are from the King James Version. I chose to do this to make sure that it's easy for you to replicate our findings. Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 are a three-part consolation prophecy. Part 1 begins with chapter 40 and ends with chapter 55, verse 5. Part 2 begins with chapter 55, verse 6 and continues through chapter 59, 21. And the third part begins with chapter 60 and continues through the end of the book. This means that Isaiah 53 appears in part 1 of the consolation prophecy, and therefore we will examine the chapters from that section only. Many of the themes and ideas that appear in part 1 also appear in parts 2 and 3, but I chose not to show examples from those parts in order to keep this video short, and it's going to be pretty long as is. Please feel free to keep examining those other parts of the consolation prophecies. The first and most important word for us to look for in this part of Isaiah is the word Eved. Eved means servant, and it, singular and plural, appear 13 times in chapters 40 through 55. We'll go through them. Isaiah 53 appears in verse 11. He shall see the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. 41:8. But thou, Israel, art my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend. 41:9. Thou art my servant, I have chosen thee, and not cast thee away. That's the next verse, of course. 42:1. Behold my servant, who I uphold, mine elect, in whom my soul delighteth. In this case, the servant is not positively identified, but is described as blind and deaf in verses 18 and 19. Hear, ye deaf, and look, ye blind, that ye may see. Who is blind but my servant? Or deaf is my messenger that I sent? Who is blind as he that is perfect, and blind as the Lord's servant? 43:10. Ye are my witness, saith the Lord, and my servant, whom I have chosen. The servant is positively identified in verse 1 of the chapter. 44:1. Yet now hear, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I have chosen. 44:2. Fear not, O Jacob, my servant, and thou, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen. 44:21. Remember these, O Jacob, and Israel, for thou art my servant. I have formed thee. Thou art my servant, O Israel. Thou shalt not be forgotten of me. 45:4. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect. 48:20. Go ye forth of Babylon, flee from the Chaldeans, with a voice of singing declare ye, tell this, utter it even to the end of the earth, saith ye, the Lord hath redeemed his servant Jacob. 49:3. And said unto me, thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But in this case, actually, the servant is the prophet Isaiah. This is clear from the following verses. Chapter 52:13. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled, and be very high. The servant is not positively identified here. 54:17. And here we have a plural reference to God's servants, plural. No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. In those 12 verses, the servant is positively identified as Jacob or Israel, and or Israel 8 times. Once it refers to the prophet Isaiah, once as the servants of God in plural, and 3 times the servant is not positively identified. In one of those verses, however, the servant is described as blind and deaf to God's Torah, and, well, in all cases except for 49:3, where the servant is Isaiah himself, Israel is a perfect fit. And indeed, the servant and Israel or Jacob are referred to so often that they are, for all intents and purposes, synonymous. Let's look at the next word, Zroa, God's strong arm. Isaiah 51:3 reads, "Who hath believed our report, and whom is the arm of the Lord revealed?" God's arm, comforting, or strong appears in 7 verses from chapters 40 through 55. God's arm appears in chapter 40:10, 40:11, 48:14, 51:4, 51:9, and 52:10. Isaiah 53 aside, in every case, God's arm is saving or comforting Israel or punishing the nations for their mistreatment of Israel. Chapter 40 begins, "Console, console my people, says your God. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem, and call to her, for she has become full from her host, for her iniquity has been appeased. For she is taken from the hand, Zroa, of the Lord, double for all her sins." Chapter 48, "His arm is on the Chaldeans, Israel's Babylonian captors." Chapter 51:5, "My righteousness is near, my salvation is gone forth, and my arms shall judge the people. The isles shall wait upon me, and on mine arm shall they trust." Chapter 52:10 says, "The Lord hath made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God." And even Isaiah 53:1 refers to salvation, because Isaiah 53 is merely a continuation of chapter 52. The next idea is the idea that the servant will be despised, degraded, afflicted, etc. In Isaiah 53, the word is nivzeh, but other words describing this despised state are used, words such as bozenefesh and aniyah, among others. Isaiah 53 reads, "He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid as if it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not." This same idea appears in chapters 42, 45, 48, 49, 51, and 53. In chapter 54:4, the subject of degradation is a widow, ashamed and forsaken. Another metaphor appears several times in Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. Another reoccurring theme in part 1 of the redemption prophecies is God's statement that he is behind Israel's suffering, and in more than one case that it is his desire that the servant suffer. In Isaiah 53, this idea appears in verse 10, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, he hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." In Isaiah 42, it is Jerusalem that has received a double portion of the Lord's punishment. In Isaiah 42:24, God is identified as the one who gave Jacob for a spoil and Israel to the robbers because of their sins and disobedience. In the very next verse, God pours out his fury on Jacob, who takes no heed. In chapter 43:28, God's punishment is against the princes of the sanctuary and Israel. All told, the suffering subject, whether referred to as the servant or as the nation, appear more than a dozen times in chapter 40 through 55. Other themes from Isaiah 53 that appear throughout this section of Isaiah are the nations, kings and people, goyim, amim, melachim, etc., who appear more than 15 times. The theme of redemption, salvation, comforting, together appear more than 30 times in this section. Other themes that run throughout the section that don't necessarily appear in Isaiah 53 are the idea of clearing the refugee's path to return to Zion, dry straw or dry land, keeping the Torah and the commandments, and God as the creator and ruler of heaven and earth, among others. What's the point of all this? It's actually quite simple. Isaiah 53 cannot stand alone. It's deeply woven into the consolation prophecies that makes up Isaiah chapters 40 through 55, and indeed through the end of the book. Reading Isaiah 53 by itself, trying to make it stand alone, amounts to nothing more than taking the chapter out of its context, and the context is the suffering and redemption of the nation of Israel. Finally, if you have any doubt about what I've said, read Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 in Hebrew. If you can't read Hebrew, open a good translation like the one online at Chabad.org and read these chapters at one sitting, paying attention to each of Isaiah's wholly interwoven themes. Thank you, Kol Tuv, and God bless.